Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. And today I want to talk about a modern game that I absolutely loved, and that is FromSoftware's Dark Souls 3. Now, as I've said in my previous Souls videos, my other From Software videos, I've been going through the entire series because I missed out on so many of the previous games. I'd played through some of the later entries, and so I wanted to come back and complete them. And Dark Souls 3 was the last game in the series I had never touched. After I finished Dark Souls 2, I jumped right into this one, and I had an absolute blast playing Dark Souls 3. From the get-go, from the very start, I could tell that this was an incredibly polished game that was going to give me a ton of excitement, a ton of fun as I played throughout it. And I wasn't disappointed in the slightest. I will say right off the bat, this feels like probably the most accessible game in the series outside of maybe Elden Ring. This I think was probably the first step FromSoftware saw in introducing a more mainstream audience to the Souls series in general. I think the difficulty curve was a lot to deter people, including myself back in the day, because I saw the player base as people that just thought they were really cool for being games. And I understand why they felt really cool, because they were hard. But Dark Souls 3 kind of guides you a little more as you progress throughout the beginning sections of the game. I would even say the first half of the game, maybe quarter to a half of the game, is probably the easiest in any Dark Souls game ever. And then after that, it really starts to ramp up and puts you through your paces, gives you some more incredible challenges, which I really like. I think this game is fantastic for introducing someone to the Souls series. Or if they're not going to play any other game, if they just play Dark Souls 3, they would probably have a good time. Part of the reason is this came out, I believe that this was developed probably hand in hand with Bloodborne, or at least back to back with Bloodborne, and you can definitely see the influences from Bloodborne. It still feels like the combat from a Dark Souls game, but really ramped up to be somewhere in between those two. So you don't have the intense action the entire time, but you still have the more slow-paced defensive playstyle from a Dark Souls series. It's somewhere in between those two, and it feels really good. Like I said, right from the get-go, I could tell that this was incredibly polished. I love the option. I got twin blades right at the beginning. I was able to infuse them with a firestone pretty early on and make them these fire twin blades. Really powerful all the way through the game. I used them for the entire thing. I only made a different weapon. I think I made a lightning katana later on in the game to deal with some more difficult bosses that weren't responding well to the fire. But for the most part, I was just able to use the twin blades. And that's what I love about any Dark Souls game, but especially Dark Souls 3. They did a great job of balancing the weapons to make them really work for any situation. There were some bosses that I really needed some range, but I didn't have it, so I just had to figure out a way to rush them down and attack them multiple times using the twin blades or using a combination of swapping between having the dual wielding and then having a shield out at times. I love that any From Software game just really hones in on letting you craft your experience the way that you want it to be, letting you play whatever playstyle you want. Like I've said previously, I'm a melee build player. I typically like to just get in there and swing a bunch of times. I don't like blocking very much, so the emphasis on more action in this game really appealed to me, and I liked it quite a bit. But also the presentation is phenomenal. Jumping into this game, you can tell right away that a ton of love and care was put into everything, every asset, every texture, every environment that you go through, the character models, everything looks and plays just absolutely gorgeously. Everything is smooth. It's almost like a beefed up version of Bloodborne. It feels a little more smooth than that game, and I loved how smooth and fluid Bloodborne was. So I really want to give the props to FromSoftware for creating such an effortless experience to really drive home that action, drive home the combat. It's fantastic. I love it. And then there's the bosses. Now, as I said previously, the first half of this game for me felt like the easiest in any Souls game I'd ever played. It felt like kind of baby's first Dark Souls, almost in a lot of ways. That's not to say it's easy, but for someone that played the rest of the series, jumping into Dark Souls 3 last, I was like, well, yeah, okay, this is definitely going to be a little bit easier experience. And I think the first real big challenge I ran into was the Abyss Watchers. I think that's typically the first big boss that people fight. And it's a multi-boss. You have different variants of the Abyss Watchers coming out to fight you until the second phase. And you can utilize that to your advantage. Some of them will actually attack each other. It's an interesting way to play the game. And once you figure out the mechanics of the fight, it becomes much easier, but still a difficult fight. And that was when I was like, okay, good. We have some difficult fights in this game. I was worried that it was going to be too much of a breeze. And by the time I got to halfway through the game, I'm like, man, I don't know. The challenge isn't ramping up very much. This is just probably the easiest Dark Souls game. And then the latter half comes and really just starts kicking you in the face, especially with the late game bosses, namely the King of Storms and the Nameless King duo. That is a pretty difficult fight. I think I've seen a ton of of stuff prior to playing Dark Souls 3 about this fight in particular and how grueling and difficult it was, and people having a lot of grievances with how hard the fight was. I think after I got past the first phase a few times and got good at that phase specifically, then I felt much better about the rest of the fight. I could get to the second phase and feel much more confident, even though the attacks were huge and sweeping and the movement was a little bit hard to predict, and some of the delayed attacks make it really hard to accurately time your dodges and your blocks. I felt like it was just a really fun fight overall. It took me learning the first phase of the fight to really hone in and understand how I was going to complete this. But after I got past that, I thought that the Nameless King was actually an incredibly fun fight and fairly fair overall. There are some really big BS attacks that he'll throw out sometimes, but for the most part, it feels pretty balanced. It feels like something that's very doable. When you complete it, you feel exceptionally good about yourself, which is really cool. But that pales in comparison to the DLC in this game. The DLC for Dark Souls 3, the bosses in those are miles harder than anything in the base game, besides maybe like the Nameless King. Everything else is just a piece of cake, comparatively speaking. You have things like Frida. I think Frida might have been... Oh man, I can't decide if Frida was the hardest boss in the game or if it was just the most rewarding to beat. Frida is a boss that takes 3 phases to complete. Now, 3-phase boss is ridiculous, especially when you don't get any kind of healing back. You don't get any kind of respite really at all. This 3-phase fight really tests your endurance and your ability to adapt to each phase. The first phase is pretty simple and basic. Once you learn the basic attack patterns, it becomes fairly... mundane getting through, honestly. It's like, I know what I'm expecting, I know what I can do, I know when to block, I know when to dodge. I could get through really easily, but the second phase starts to get a little more difficult. You have the tandem between Frida and the other dude. I'm forgetting the name and the specifics here, but it becomes this crazy double fight that is very difficult to get through because of the way that they attack in tandem. You have to be focusing on one at a time. Frida is much faster and has more sweeping attacks. She's really terrifying. And then the third phase is just her going all out, and it is absolutely horrifying to try and get through that fight. That was probably the most rewarding experience I've ever had in a Souls game, period. Finishing that fight was really just a really powerful moment for me. I felt like I could accomplish anything at all. And that was fantastic. And then I got to the Ring City DLC, and I got my teeth kicked in right again. The demon fight, the dual demon fight that turned into another phase with the demon prince is also gruelingly difficult. They swap positions. One of them will be shooting poison at you, and one of them's charging with fire attacks. And then they'll swap places and kind of change their tactics and do what they're doing. And once you fell one of them, the other one becomes more powerful. When you fell that one, you feel like you've finished the fight. Then it becomes the demon prince, and you have to fight an even harder version. That one was really difficult. I expected to get through that one much faster, but it was very hard to manage the two bosses at the same time. They were so fast. And then once you got to the final phase, sometimes he called giant fireballs at you, and it was terrifying. Man, that DLC started off with a bang. And then, of course, you've got the giant dragon. I'm forgetting the name of the dragon here. I think it's Midir. Yeah. How could I forget? Midir was absolutely just gut-wrenching to fight. This was probably the hardest DLC boss in the Souls series I think I've ever fought. It's a toss-up between Frida and Midir here. And I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion, but I felt like he was significantly harder than Frida, than Gale, which I'll talk about in a second, than the Nameless King. I think that Midir was probably the most difficult thing I've ever faced. Huge attacks, really hard timing to dodge and to block. You get eaten up your stamina, and you take huge bits of damage every time you get hit, no matter how high level you are. It doesn't matter what weapon you're using. You have to be perfect on this fight to really run away with it and win. It feels like an incredible slog. The first bit of it, I felt like I was doing something wrong, or I was using something that I was completely resistant to because I was dealing such little damage. Come to find out, that's just how it works. That's just kind of how the fight is. He's just a huge tank, and running at him head first is going to get you killed because you don't have nearly enough damage to take him down quickly. And I had to learn over time. It took me probably about 6 hours to finally beat this boss. I have never struggled so hard to get through a boss like I did with this stupid dragon. But again, it felt like one of the most triumphant victories I've ever achieved. And that's what I think Dark Souls 3 does the best. With the last boss in the thing, the slave Gale, is really ridiculously hard too. He comes at you super fast, running attacks. He can jump in the air. Like he'll cover such a huge distance in such a short period of time. You have very little time to react, to dodge, to block, whatever you need to do. He is a terrifying fight. And that's what the DLC, I think, does best. It really ramps up everything that you had with the base game. Every hard fight you had in the base game, it ramps it up, does something different, plays with your expectations, and gives you something more, something unique. And that's what I love about FromSoft DLCs especially, but this one does it so perfectly. It not only plays with your expectations, but ramps up the challenge in a major way so that you really have to test your mettle. Even if you've beaten the entire base game and you know everything about Dark Souls 3, you are fantastic at this game, these bosses will push you to your absolute limit. It's a phenomenal experience from top to bottom. I would highly recommend, if you're going to get Dark Souls 3, get the Fire Fades edition. I got it on Amazon for like $20. It's going to come with all the DLC, and the DLC is absolutely worth your time. They can be difficult to get through. Just the runs to get to the bosses are pretty difficult. Luckily, they have pretty good checkpointing in the DLC, so if you get through a really particularly difficult run, you can have a checkpoint right outside the boss, and you'll be good to go. But yeah, this game is fantastic. From the base game to the DLC, the fights are really phenomenal. Like I said, the early game bosses are not nearly as hard. Sometimes they pose a big challenge. Sometimes they're pretty easy to overcome. But the environments are beautifully done. I love the callbacks to the original Dark Souls. This is a direct sequel to Dark Souls, so there's a lot of similarities in the environments and the lore and everything. I'm not super big on the lore, but I like learning what I do learn about it. I love seeing other videos that touch on the lore in more depth, and I get to learn about those things. But this one really feels like everything that FromSoft had done well up to this point. They had learned from Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, even Demon Souls, and then of course Bloodborne. They incorporated everything they had learned into this game, into a culmination to finish off the Dark Souls series, as it were, before moving on to things like Sekiro and Elden Ring. They just really knocked it out of the park here. It's everything that people would love about the original Dark Souls, cranked up to 11. And if you like Dark Souls and you like Bloodborne, this is absolutely the game for you. If you somehow missed out on Dark Souls 3 like I did, I highly recommend going out and getting it. It's really easy to buy, like I said previously. I'm going to give Dark Souls 3 a platinum rank. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.